Welcome to Legendary Exits, conversations with purpose-driven entrepreneurs. In this series, we sit down with the leaders and legends who turned their exits into opportunities for impact. We explore living lives of significance, leveraging exits to fund personal and financial goals, and building a best-in-class business along the way. You ready? Let's dive in.
Hey, welcome to the Legendary Exits podcast, where we interview exited legends, leaders who are building, and those that guide them. Hey, I'm Micah Brandenburg. I'm excited to have John Martin with us today on the pod. John, welcome. So glad you could carve out some time to be with us.
Absolutely, man. I'm glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Hey, as we kick things off, help everybody who's listening just get a little bit of the lay of the land. Who are you? Tell us about your family. Tell us about where you're at geographically. Tell us about what you're doing. Tell us about what you're passionate about, however you want to take that question.
Yeah. So my name's John Martin, as you introduced me. Funny thing is, a lot of times I do go by Martin. So for anybody that's listening, it's not always John. I am 47 years old. I just started my own legal practice back in July after around 8 years with Big Law. The move was driven out of frustration with how law firms are managed, how legal services are delivered, and how attorneys work. One thing was family. I got three boys, 11, 9, and 5. And Big Law is very difficult to manage with family life.
Love it.
Two things are difficult to reconcile. So, I'm trying to build a little bit of a different model here that focuses on family, focuses on delivering services efficiently and effectively.
I love it. So you're an entrepreneur, you're building your own practice, you've worked in big corporate, you're coming down and doing your own thing. You've got young kids. I love all this sort of stuff. That's very relevant to our listeners who are building their own practices. I'm just sort of curious, frustration with how Big Law was run. What do you mean by that?
I came out of the military. I went straight into the military right out of high school. That organization is very hierarchical. You know who's in charge at all times. You know who's in charge of you. And then I went to, through my co-op with engineering at Clemson, I worked in a big corporate environment. And again, it was fairly hierarchical. There were departments, there were divisions.
So pause in there for a quick moment. A lot of folks thinking attorneys think undergrad to law school. You had a different route. That's really interesting. Tell us about that. What kind of engineering were you studying in undergrad?
I did mechanical engineering at Clemson, and a lot of that was driven by my grandfather and my uncle. They said nobody's really worth the salt unless they have an engineering degree, and then they can do anything else. So.
Awesome. We're going to talk more about that because you grew up in a family generational business. It's part of your unique point of view. That's really cool. Keep going.
So those organizations were pretty clear who was in charge, how they were structured. With the bigger corporate, there are political factions and there's some movement across different areas. And it's a little bit more murky. And then I went to the family business, which is, I like to classify as a benign dictatorship. And then you get to law and you're like, well, the managing partner's in charge, and they're not. I finally drew the analogy between the U.S. House of Representatives and how law firms are managed. And essentially, if you think of the managing partner as your Speaker of the House, they try to set direction. They try to whip factions. They're constantly negotiating politically. They're constantly talking people off the ledge. But then at the end of the day, the partners, who are, in the analogy of representatives, they go back to their districts, their constituents, who are their clients, the associates that work for them, the staff. And if they're generating enough revenue in their district, in their book of business, then they do whatever they want. They don't have to follow the direction of the organization. And it makes it very hard to drive any kind of change or set any kind of unified direction. So that was very frustrating. And then you have all these little fiefdoms where there's very little crossover. People are very protective of the people they work with and for.
So protecting the client list, don't want to expose those clients to other attorneys in the firm.
And access to associates. So as an associate, a partner might say, no, I don't want you working for anybody else.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't have a full load right now, because something might come up. So workflow management, performance management, all those things were really based on how many hours you could bill and what your relationship was with the partner, and that was frustrating to me.
I love
Just
it. So
a lot of
you've got a story of growing up in a family generational business that we're going to get to in a moment. But what I'm hearing from you is from upbringing, from early career, you have, like everybody, certain things you believe, certain things you value, and you just found that those weren't able to be fully fulfilled and fully lived out in large corporate M&A, because you did work, as a heads up, you worked for the top 50 M&A law firm in the country, correct?
I did, yeah. I worked for one firm here in Atlanta with about 250 lawyers. I think it was AmLaw 50, and then I went to Baker Hostetler, which was over 1,100 lawyers, 18 offices. So that was.
So for you, and it's okay if you don't, but is that sort of clear in your mind? Like, what are those values? What are those beliefs that are super important to you that led you to leave large corporate and actually start your own firm because you felt like you were just frustrated with what was going on there?
So the values that I espouse for my firm, and I don't know that I could have clearly articulated these when I left, but the three are family, critical thinking, and efficiency.
What was the first one again?
Family.
Family, critical thinking, and efficiency. Yeah. Interesting. Let's segue actually into talking about your background in a family business, since that is one of your values. Tell us about that story. What was this family business? Where was it located at? What generation were you part of? What was it like to sort of grow up in that environment?
It was interesting. My grandfather and his brother-in-law, so my grandmother's brother, founded the business in 1953.
Wow.
And it started with them sewing, or they actually had my grandmother and my great aunt running sewing machines, just their home sewing machines. They were sewing what you call pipe diapers. And it's something you wrap it around a pipe, then you pour grout, concrete pipe, pour grout to seal the pipe.
Sure.
And that evolved into, they had to run wire through the seams.
Got it.
So they started making their own wire, and then they're like, oh, well, we're selling, they're buying wire on these construction sites. It's exactly the same wire. So why don't we coil it into 3.5-pound coils and sell it for rebar tie wire? And then and then accidentally they came up with an annealing recipe that made it very, very soft, but extremely strong.
Strong but flexible. So we're in the wire business. That's the context, correct?
Yep.
Very cool.
Yeah. So it was this pipe diaper business where they were sewing seams, and then they had a wire business. They kind of grew from that, and then the company became two divisions. One division was sewing disposable clothing, and I think today they do sonic welding of disposable clothing. And then
where's the business located at? And obviously we're at year 72. The 75th anniversary is coming up in 3 years, but where in the U.S. is it located? And give us just a sense of the size and scope, with perhaps the number of employees that work there, or size of the facility.
Yeah. So if you're from there, it's McBee, South Carolina. If you're not from there and you're reading the sign, it's McBee. I think we've had this conversation on a show.
My wife and I, there's a street in Greenville with that name, and my wife and I have had an argument about how to pronounce it for 20 years. So I'm with you. It's McBee. That's
it's
what
McBee. Period. It's
a Southern woman early in my career corrected me on that. So keep going.
Yeah, it's in McBee, South Carolina. And when I lived there, I told people that I was part of the 1%.
Okay.
And that was 1% of the population that didn't live within 20 miles of a Walmart.
Okay. I like that. And I know your family has had a strong focus on serving employees. That came out in a conversation with your brother that I had a couple months ago. So really cool, really neat sort of a business. Any particular lessons that stood out for you? I think one of the things that's really interesting to think about is maybe a couple different questions. One, with your own experience of growing up in a family business and now being an M&A attorney that's serving all sorts of companies, right? Converting companies to ESOP, selling to private equity. What's different about a family business than, a non-family business?
Well, first of all, I mean, almost every business, if it's closely held, is a family business because families depend on it. And, and I think the key distinction when you start talking about family business in the context of what we do It's how many family members are in the business.
Got it.
So if you have multi-generational, if you have, in the case of my grandfather and his brother-in-law, you have ownership among family groups. Maybe it's brothers, maybe it's in-laws, but anybody that's dealing with family and working with family,
Yes.
it's a different dynamic because you're bringing in not just what happened last week, not just what happened even in the last 10 years that you've been working with somebody, or during the history of the 40-hour a week or so relationship. You're talking about, hey, I knew that guy the day he was born.
Yes.
And he picked on me, or I picked on him, or we drank our first beer together and got in trouble and had to get there's just lots more there. There's lots more history there. And it makes it a little bit, I won't say awkward,
Okay.
but there's a different dynamic with people that are not family.
Yeah.
So, especially for observers that
I'll
are
jump
going,
in
oh,
and
wow.
I'll say business is always about people. Like even with my finance background, operations background, I always say the number one issue in business is people. And what's really interesting, even for companies we consult with who are multi-generational family businesses, is the number one issue is not valuation of the company, spreading financials, all this technical analysis. It's actually getting the different generations to speak openly and honestly with one another, right? Because I know in my own family, I grew up in a big family. I've got one brother and 4 sisters, 6 siblings. When we get back together, and I'm the fourth at 43 years old. When we get back together, there is a magnetic draw to fall back into those family dynamics that you had since you were a child. So, yeah, that's really interesting. I know you work with, in your own law practice, you work with family generational businesses. So how does that change the approach when you're dealing with a family generational business? Because you understand those dynamics better than most.
Right. Well, the biggest thing it changes for me is who I bring to the table. And one of the things I do with family businesses is I've engaged a licensed professional counselor. So
Oh, wow.
I bring a therapist.
Okay.
And some of that comes from my experience with the family business. We were experiencing heightened conflict, and my dad's like, "Hey, let's go see a counselor," and that was helpful. In our case, it was a little bit too little, too late. But one of the lessons I drew from that experience is, hey, this can be very helpful in identifying conflict and fleshing through some of these historical issues. And I think the biggest thing with a family business, you go into any business really with the approach of, okay, let's solve the problem. Yes. I think with a family business, you got to really understand the family dynamic, because that's going to both dictate how you solve the problem, whether you can solve the problem, and what the solution is.
Let's dive into that just a little bit more. Talk to me about family dynamics. Are we just talking about power struggles? Hey, I was the dad and you were a child, and so I dictate everything? Or is it, how do you think about that? Or even the person you partner with as a therapist, like, what are you looking for when you say the dynamics are different?
Well, it's just what you referenced, right? So you being the 4th child, I'm sure when you go back to your family, you fall into a certain role. Yes. And I'm guessing, I don't know this, but I'm guessing that they don't see you as a very successful business leader that steps in, takes control, and guides people through these very complex situations. That's not Micah. Micah is whatever, right? So
he was the kid wearing Spider-Man T-shirts and sunglasses from when he was 5 years old.
Exactly, right? Like that kid, he reads comic books. He didn't know anything about business. And you see a lot of those same dynamics in every family. Yes. But when you overlay business with that, it's like, okay, so sister, who has always been the one that gives in, accommodates, and does all these things within the family dynamic, well, maybe she went off and had some really strong experience, some really strong leadership experience, and actually could come in and drive some change in that business and get people going in a different direction. But the family doesn't see her that way. So beginning to understand those dynamics and help people kind of parse through these roles overlaid with business is one of the things we try to do.
I think you're keying in on something that is so highly valuable for both family-run businesses as well as any business, and that is what we do, picking what we do and how we do it, right? In our situation where we guide companies who are going to transition in the future, right? What the transition mechanism is or how it works. That's the what we can do. That's really not the most important thing. The most important thing is really understanding the motivations, understanding the goals, understanding the desires, understanding the objectives. Coming back to since you're such a deep expert in this area, what are you trying, other than just understanding motivations, is there anything in particular you're really trying to uncover to craft a win-win between these various generations?
The other thing that we really focus on are what are people's expectations and goals.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that goes unsaid because maybe dad or mom just assumes, well, the kids want the business, right? They're gonna do the same thing I did. Maybe the kids are like,
Yeah.
I'm
No
gonna
idea.
sell
Yeah.
this thing. I wanna go, live in the Caribbean and write novels,
Or-
and I'm gonna use this as my seed money.
Agreed. And I'll give you another one. I was on a call with the Family Generational Business out of Connecticut recently. 5 children working in the business. The most senior one was the president. And I got the father and her on a call. And I said to the father, hey, can you move on from the business if we start turning off cash distributions and exclude the value? And he said, no, I really can't retire just yet. I need a little bit more. And the daughter pipes up and says, well, Dad, I thought you were going to gift us the business. And so it was very clear in that moment that those expectations had not really been discussed. And very frequently, because of those power dynamics in parent-child relationships, that's a real challenge.
Well, and money's a funny thing, right? Like, did your parents tell you what they paid for their house?
Yeah.
Did you know what your dad made when you were 10 years? You get those dynamics. You don't ask those things.
Yeah.
Like, Dad, how much money do you have saved up?
I know.
Dad's gonna be like, I'm not telling you that. You're my kid. So
Exactly. Hey, let's bring us up to speed to today. We talked about undergrad engineering, Clemson, in mechanical engineering, right? And then you did go to work in the family business. Just super briefly, tell us how long that was. Tell us, why did you end up going back to law school? What was that all about? How did you get to today real succinctly?
So I went back to the family business with an engineering degree, and I asked my dad, I was like, what do you want me to do? He's like, I don't know. They were coming out of kind of a period of downturn, and they were running lean as far as personnel. And after a couple weeks, Dad walked out on the plant floor and pulled me out from under a machine where I was just trying to clean up and make myself useful. And he said, you're an engineer me a logistics department.
Okay.
Okay, Dad.
There you go. Get the big top level commission from the CEO.
Yeah, engineer me a logistics department. Okay, I'll figure it out. I'll learn it.
Okay.
So I did, and we took our order processing times from 5 to 7 days to everything shipped within 24 hours or less.
Awesome.
So took that experience, and then as you kind of you start digging into that, I realized, all right, I got problems with my demand planning. So I tackled that, and then I realized I can't get the information I need. We need a new software system. So we designed one and had it coded in India, implemented it, got the information I needed, and realized that my China purchasing was out of whack. So I started going to China 3 and 4 times a year to buy and negotiate and get that figured out.
It sounds like logistics turned upstream into supply chain for you. Keep going.
Yeah. Kind of kept, it's an onion. You solve one problem and you find the next one. You're like, well, this isn't quite good enough. How do I, you're just always moving to the root cause.
I just want to park there for a quick second, because the way you described it, it's like an onion where you solve one and you move on to the next layer. That is how real change takes place. And I don't think we should jump past that for anybody who's listening. We don't go from 0 to 100. You don't go from immature to mature. You take the next steps of visibility on the journey, you capture it, and then the next thing after that gets unlocked. And I think your story is just an amazing example of that. So back to you. Keep going, John.
Well, and probably the most amazing thing about my experience there is I was in a situation where I wasn't locked into one department. I wasn't locked into engineering. I wasn't locked into logistics. I had the latitude to go and kind of solve the problems as I saw them.
Yes.
And that was a luxury that I don't know could have been replicated anywhere. And ultimately, that was part of the problem and why I left the business. My brother came in 3 years after I did, and he came in very focused on sales. Like this is the area, and that was one area I hadn't touched, no big deal. But and this is where you start talking about family dynamics, there is a constant tension between operations and sales, production and sales. You know,
Yes.
how do you marry those two? And then you overlay a brotherly dynamic where where the oldest child is trying to just kind of picking at the onion and pulling apart whatever he sees and trying to fix things. And then when it starts bumping up against that, younger sibling,
Yep.
get tension. And after about 3 years, it culminated and was at a pretty untenable level. And that's when we got our counselor involved. And at the same time, I had kind of been thinking, I'd been dealing with lawyers. I had HR attorneys that I dealt with, I felt like every day. I had an IP attorney that I'd negotiated some of the software stuff with. I had attorneys in Shanghai that did my foreign purchasing. I had attorneys in DC that did foreign trade. I had attorneys, just a general corporate attorney. And through all of those, I'm like, I would get done talking to the attorney and be like, if I just knew the rules, this seems like it would be pretty easy.
Yes.
And that coupled with the tension in the business, I looked at my dad and said, I need a break. How about I go to law school?
Cool.
And he said, great, we need a lawyer.
So all of those experiences of being exposed to the legal profession through business is what took you back to law school. That's really awesome. I want to circle back around to something you said though, real quick, and that is the tension between you and your younger brother, where you were leading operations and he was leading sales. Hindsight is 2020, and you've got the privilege and the blessing of that right now. What would you do differently now? Because I think what you experience with a family member is, so many folks who are listening to this, they can resonate with that with somebody who's not a family member, just with a peer in the business that they. So my question to you is this: now that you had the benefit of hindsight on that tension and that conflict you had with a peer leader in the business, what would you do differently now?
I would, and it's funny, I tell everybody this for all kinds of different situations, whether it's going into work with a family member, whether it's somebody that's engaged and getting ready to get married, whatever it is. I say, both of you go to a counselor right now while things are good and while things are new, and talk to that therapist about how you're going to deal with conflict and where potential areas of conflict may reside. And begin to build that framework with a professional who knows how to do these things before you get to a point where you're trying to heal wounds. And I think the biggest thing though, right, and I've learned this through counseling, is be vulnerable. Say, I think this is how it made me feel. This is what I think I heard you say. Is that right? Yeah. Approach it with curiosity. I think you always want to approach things with curiosity and not defensiveness.
Yes.
That's probably the key thing in dealing with conflict. Because generally, both parties, it's a misunderstanding, right?
Yes.
And everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants the same benefits. It's just going back to that, hey, we're trying to get to the same spot, but something's not clicking. Let me approach this with curiosity and try and figure out why.
If I would break down your example, I would say you're using I statements. You're not attacking the other person. This is what but you're saying what you felt or what you observed. I felt this way as a result of X, or I observed this as a result of X. What is your thoughts about that? What's your perception about that? You're coming with curiosity, not accusation. One of the things I learned as a young man, this has just stuck with me. I think it was a youth minister who shared this, and he said, questions provoke the conscience, accusations harden the will. And that's beautiful. So if you're in a tough conversation, you're going to have a tough conversation with someone, right? If you come in and say, you're wrong, you did this, your intentions were X, that's an accusation that's going to harden them. You're going to put them into a corner. But if you're asking a question, hey, I observed this, something you did made me feel this way, and I was curious what your thoughts were on that, I think that's going to provoke the conscience. And I think you've given us a great example of how to live that out with I statements and sharing sort of what you experienced. So
much easier to tell other people to do than it is to actually.
Oh yes, isn't it? We're always, and that's the challenge of life, right? Is it's so easy and it's so clear to see what the issues are in somebody else's life, but can we see it in our own life? Are we able to discern that? Are we able to implement that? Do we want to? Do we have the will to?
And I think the other thing there, when you talk, that triggered something else is, think about the other person's narrative.
Mm.
Everybody, two people, and I've seen this over and over again with my dad's siblings, or even my siblings. You start talking about something that happened in the family or something that happened years ago, and somebody tells a story, and they're like, another person's like, no, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
This is what happened. And
Yeah.
perception really kind of changes things, and you always got to
Got it.
think about it from what's the other person, how are they telling this
Yes.
story, and
Yeah, I
being
think
willing
you're
to.
bringing up two really key things that I'll summarize. The first is um, great leadership in business is always thinking about things from another person's point of view. Whether it's our customers that we are trying to understand by developing a buyer persona and saying, well, what do they want? Whether it's our employees and understanding what they want, right? Whether it's in a conversation. I think focusing on what other people want is the foundation of great leadership. I think one of the foundations, not the, but one of the foundations. And then, yeah, I think that's just amazing. Hey, I want to transition to just talking a little bit about your role as an M&A attorney. What does a great attorney do? Hey, prepping for the process of selling a company and all these sorts of things that I think so many folks who are first time entrepreneurs are confused about, right? So many folks who are even in a family generational business are a little bit confused about it. So I want to go there, and I just want to start with asking you a question. Corporate attorneys, M&A attorneys, mergers and acquisitions, what's the difference between those two? Let's start there.
I think of a corporate, well, there's a lot of overlap, and I
Yeah,
don't know that there's a huge designation between the two.
sure.
There are M&A attorneys that can do corporate work, and there are corporate attorneys that can do M&A work.
Yes.
And what you want to look for in an attorney that has, that you want to do a transaction for you, it is the number of reps. How many
Mm,
transactions have they done?
got
How
it.
many transactions have they done recently? What kinds of transactions have they done?
Okay.
Because a lot of times you get a corporate attorney, just a general corporate attorney, and he does lots of commercial contract review. He does a
Yes.
little, and some corporate attorneys say, well, yeah, I'll litigate that for you, or they're kind of a jack of all trades,
Yep.
and they may have done an asset purchase here and there. They may have done a couple transactions in the last couple years.
Yes. I want to follow up on something. You said three things. As folks are thinking about hiring an M&A attorney, they want to think, or corporate attorney who says they can do an M&A. How many transactions have they done? The recency and the kinds of. The quantity is easy, right? It's like if you only did one last year, you don't have a lot of experience. But if you did 10, if you did 20, if you did 50 last year, great. Obviously, the recency. Hey, if I did 20, but it's been 3 years ago since I've done one, right? But talk to us about when you said kinds of transactions. Help us think about a framework. Why is it important? What are the kinds of transactions that an M&A attorney could do, and what does somebody actually want to look for in terms of, hey, I'm taking my company to market. I'm a few years out. What am I looking for as I ask that question of what kinds of deals they've done?
The biggest, if you can find someone that specializes in your particular industry,
Okay.
you're going to be in really good shape, because that attorney will have dealt with the investment bankers, the business brokers, the people that focus on that industry.
Got it.
They will have
And why
seen
is that
all.
important? I mean, just speak to us as if we don't know anything, because again, I know you've done, I don't know how many deals you've done. You can share with us, but probably hundreds of deals. But for most
Yeah.
folks, they're going to do one deal in their lifetime, two deals, three deals in their lifetime. So why is industry experience by an M&A attorney actually important?
Let's back up.
Okay.
What does a good M&A attorney do? They
Yes.
get the deal closed,
Okay.
and they get it closed with minimal friction and maximum risk reduction for their client.
Get the deal closed. What percentage of deals, in your opinion, don't close? Have you seen in your career?
Very few, actually, that I've
Don't.
worked on.
Yeah.
I think I've done over 350,
Okay.
and I probably had maybe 10 to 15 that just fell apart.
Got it. You think that's the norm, or do you think there's a lot of attorneys out there where, because of inexperience or so
I
forth, there's a lot more that are blowing apart?
I was in a very focused M&A shop, and we were industry specific. And when
Yep.
people came to us we got the deal done.
Yeah, because you're talking
And
about a 3%. If you did 350 deals and 10 fell out in your lifetime, that's 3 to 5%, right? So I want to just dig into a couple of quick things in this follow up here. So getting the deal done, that's what folks want to look for. I actually want to rephrase the question. The question is this: what is a best in class M&A attorney? If somebody who's listening to this says, I'm going to sell my company in the next 3 to 10 years, and I want to start linking arms with an M&A attorney to get prepared for that. What is a best-in-class M&A attorney? How does somebody even know that they're best in class?
The best metric I can come up with is how many reps
Cool.
you have.
Yep.
If you've done upwards of 10 to 15 transactions per year for the last 5-10 years,
Yes.
you're going to have seen enough to know,
Cool.
hey, this is how deals go. These are the standard kind of things to look for. And you're going to have an inherent knowledge of where the risks are.
Let's go deeper on this just for a quick moment, and we're not going to go back and tell these attorneys that you worked with at the beginning of your career these things that maybe weren't done as well as they would be done today. But as you think about your career now, having done 350 transactions, like give us a specific example. Like what's something you do now today because of that significant experience you've got that maybe you weren't doing back then, right? That's actually delivering value to the client by getting the deal closed or by getting them better terms or sort of preserving more of the deal price.
I think the biggest thing that I have learned and the biggest difference between how I do things now versus how I would have done things starting out is the art of negotiation.
Okay.
How do you get the parties to agree on moving forward?
Got it.
And part of that is knowing what's most important to your client and being able to tell them this is the most important thing.
Yeah.
And then also calm their nerves, because a lot of time one of the biggest roles of an M&A attorney is talking your client off the ledge.
Yeah.
The other side will hit them with something and they'll blow up and they'll be like, this is ridiculous. I'm calling the whole thing off. And you're like, oh, hold on. Time out.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what this really means. Let's talk about what they're thinking, and then let's kind of normalize the expectations here, and then generally you can get them back on the wagon.
I love it. I want to go to prepping for a sale before you need to. 2 questions. Yeah. So you beat me to the punch. Nobody does it.
Nobody does it.
In your experience, when you have repped a seller out of these 350 transactions who are not private equity firms, not professional sellers, right? Family generational, privately owned. When do they come to you in the deal process typically?
After they sign the LOI.
Okay.
Or right before they sign the LOI.
Again, for our audience that's listening, if they're obviously using third-party representation with a business broker, an M&A advisor, or an investment banker at the highest level, putting together that confidential information memorandum and like packaging the company, that's what that deal professional does. But really that point where we say, I want to sell to you, almost like having a signed contract to buy a house, is the signed letter of intent. And so you're saying most people approach you after the signed letter of intent. It sounds like you're not in favor of that. Tell us why.
There's very little I can do as an attorney to mitigate risk at that point. When you only have 90 days to fix stuff, it's just not enough time. So to give people an idea of timing, right? Let's say you start talking to an investment banker 12 months out.
Okay.
Investment banker is going to do some financial stuff. They're going to try and make you look pretty. You might get a Q of E done. And then they've identified a pool of buyers probably at about the 4 to 6 month mark. And then it takes a month, 2 months for the investment banker to say, all right, here's the one that's the most attractive. Now let's get an LOI.
Okay.
And that a good investment banker will call the attorney pre-LOI.
Yep.
Doesn't always happen. Sometimes the buyer just gets it, or the seller just gets the LOI and goes, this is great, let's go. And then the LOI, then the attorney kind of has to, deal with the circumstances of trying to figure that out. Yes. LOI is generally about 90 days out from a close.
Yeah. And I want to follow up on two things around the LOI. I want to talk about what this risk is that you're concerned that you now really have no opportunity to mitigate. But then the second piece is, the common thing that you hear from so many folks, and I know you've heard this because I've heard it. Well, my LOI is non-binding, meaning they don't have to pull through to the sale. So a seller feels like oftentimes they can renegotiate in the process. Let's actually start there. Pragmatically, in your opinion, what happens if you don't do a great job of setting the deal up before the LOI? Is it possible to really sort of reset expectations under the LOI period?
It's exceedingly difficult.
Yeah.
As an attorney, if I come in after the LOI has been executed, then there are certain things that I can kind of go to the other side and go, look, man, I know this is in the LOI,
Yep.
but I didn't have an opportunity to look at it. And as a professional courtesy, the attorney on the other side most times will consider your point of view, especially if it's something pretty egregious that they know is not market. Because if I'm representing my client and putting an LOI out there, I'm going to make it as favorable as I possibly can for my buy-side client. And
so let's dig into that. Let's go there right now. You talked about the fact that you don't like to be brought in after the LOI is signed because there's not a whole lot you can do to mitigate risk. Okay, I'm going to turn it around. Most entrepreneurs, they don't care about the word risk. Let's just be honest. What they care about is the price they're getting, the taxes they're going to pay, and what they're going to net, and when they're going to get paid the cash. So I want you to talk to us in plain English and say, what are these risks and how do they affect the price? How do they affect when an entrepreneur gets paid? How do they affect taxation or these things that really are on the mind of most people who are exiting?
So the risks, so your first question there was risk. What are the risks?
Correct.
And those can be operational. They can be regulatory. They can be anything that you look at and go, wow, I might have to pay money for that. So employee practices. It could be compliance. I didn't have the right forms filled out. I mean, it could be tax. You didn't claim, you didn't file your taxes appropriately in the case of a stock deal. So there's any number of business risks that can come through on a transaction. And one of the things about a purchase agreement is the seller is making representations and warranties.
Correct.
People are like,
it's the longest part of the purchase agreement for anybody who's not been through an exit. It's like you get to the closing day, and yes, there's the price and the terms, but there's this whole laundry list of things that as a seller, you are saying that this is true. And so therefore, if it's found out to not be true after the sale, then that purchaser can come after you to some degree, correct?
I define reps and warranties as statements made by the seller upon which the purchaser can rely to establish the value of the business.
Got it. So obviously, if we make those and they're found out to be incorrect after the fact, whether that was true malice or uninformed, that buyer can come back and come after us for some quantity of money.
Yep. So reps and warranties, and then the balancing principle of reps and warranties are indemnification, which is contractual remedy, and it means I'm going to pay you if any of these reps and warranties are incorrect and you suffer a loss. I'm going to pay you for that loss.
Cool.
Yep. So where this impacts a seller in terms of the LOI is there a holdback or is there an escrow? This is money that you might otherwise think you're going to get day one.
Plain English, holdback and escrow means that a portion of that purchase price is not going to the seller on the day of closing.
Correct.
Great.
So the buyer might hold that for a year. They might hold it for 2 years. They might hold it for 3 years.
And this is a bucket of money that, based upon certain things we agree to, might come to the seller, but it might not, depending upon performance of those reps and warranties.
And depending on the buyer's strategy. So some buyers come into transactions. I represented a buyer in probably well over 150 transactions. They never made an indemnification claim. Not part of their strategy.
Yeah.
I represented another buyer who planned to make indemnification claims on every single deal so that they could juice the investment for their investors.
So John, when we were just talking a little bit about, mitigating the risk, the value of bringing you in early is that you can mitigate the risk. So plain English, we can get more money in the seller's pocket on the day of closing if a seller was to bring you in advance, follow your advice, and actually take care of certain issues in the business, whether those are financial issues, whether those are operational issues, whether those are legal issues. Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
Absolutely fair.
So tell us when. Let's go deep there just for a quick second, because I know you specialize in this in your particular firm at TreeBank Legal. Tell us when a business owner ought to bring in you or another M&A attorney. What does that time frame look like if somebody says, hey, I want to sell in a year or 3 years or 5 years or even 10 years? Is there value in bringing you in today?
Absolutely. I'm going to differentiate my firm here because most M&A attorneys are happy getting involved at 90 days.
Got it.
They're fine. They would rather they want to negotiate the LOI, they want to get the transaction done, and then they want to move on. They bill on hourly models.
Got it.
My firm is different because I'm in it for the long haul, and I want to make this the best transaction possible for the seller.
Got it.
And I want to invest upfront in going through what a buyer is going to do to them. And then we get to the transaction, and a lot of the work is already done.
Yes.
And it's probably worth touching on. I don't know if we want to put it in right here, but
yeah, go for it.
Every seller I've ever dealt with, on closing day, they are emotionally and physically exhausted. And you can tell them up front all day long, you're going to be working the equivalent of 3 full-time jobs for the next 90 days.
Yep.
They do not believe you.
Yes.
And
Just to chime in on this, one of my recent guests on the podcast who sold his business 6 years ago, he had a partner, and he said that they literally split duties once they went under agreement. And his partner ran to operational performance, so they didn't dip, and he ran the deal. And so just to affirm that, I've had another guest on this show who has said the exact same thing. So keep going.
Yeah, so you're looking at compressing, the equivalent of 3 full-time jobs into a 90-day period. You're trying to keep your business up. You're trying to keep it from dipping so the buyer can't argue that things are falling off and they owe you less money.
Yep.
You're trying to argue that there's no risk, that you don't need a holdback. If you take that work and you spread it out over 1 to 5 years,
Yep.
and then you get to the transaction, A, there's not going to be as much to do because it's already done.
Yep.
B, me as an attorney, I know your business. I'm not going to have to ask you a lot because I've already drafted all the documents they're asking for. We've already built out the data room. I know where all the skeletons are, and I know that there aren't any anymore.
Yes.
So it's a lot less, and I know your risk. I know your risk tolerance. I know, hey, this client's going to be okay with this, and I can advise them with a little bit more confidence. I can say, all right, we've talked about these things before. Remember, this is what we kind of decided. Here's how I'm going to approach this negotiation.
What I hear you saying is, when you start early, you get to do due diligence on your timeline, not the buyer's timeline. And the reason that's important is, unless you're going to stop running your business for, what would you say the average period of time is? That something's
90 days.
90 days,
90
3
to
to 6 months.
20 days. Yeah.
Unless you're going to stop running your business, which most people can't do, this puts you in the driver's seat about when you do your due diligence. The second thing I hear you saying is, actually, I haven't heard you say it yet, but I know you believe it, and so I'm going to ask you about this, is the value of due diligence just getting the deal done? Or if you were to come into a company and actually do due diligence today, would there be any value in some of the improvements that are there and actually growing the valuation of the company over the next couple of years? Talk to us about that.
Oh, absolutely. 2 that come immediately to mind, or 3. One of them, let's say you're a software provider.
Okay.
And your standard customer contract doesn't have an automatic renewal provision.
Got it.
With that automatic renewal provision, that's going to turn it into recurring revenue. It's going to up the value of the business when the buyer looks at it because they know those contracts are sticky and they're not going away. Look at employment. Are your employees properly classified? If you find out they're not, and you pay them appropriately for the next 2 years, then a lot of those statutes of limitations have run, and that's not a risk you're going to have to take. It's not money you're going to have to pay back at closing.
Got it.
foreign, and I was dealing with this morning, Office of Foreign Asset Control,
Oh yes, good old
Foreign
fact.
Corrupt Practices Act. Let's say you find out that one of your employees is bribing a foreign official.
Yeah.
If you find that out in the middle of diligence, it's going to wreck the deal. If you find it out 2 years ahead of a deal and you fire the person and you work with the authorities to mitigate the risk, you're probably going to be okay.
There's a Suits rerun. You know the show Suits. It's a legal show. I was just watching it recently, and actually one of the clients, she was accused of murder overseas for bribing officials. So your comment is very relevant with my recent TV watching.
And by the way, perfect M&A attorney, do not hire Harvey Specter. He does way too many other things.
I think what I'm hearing from you in general is we talk about risk, and obviously entrepreneurs are risk takers. Very commonly, privately owned business owners are risk takers. The key with risk is not that we have no risk; it's that we understand it, we're mitigating it, where we can. I hear you talking about getting involved in advance of the LOI to mitigate that. I hear us talking about increasing the value potentially because of some of the insights you come up with, which is great. That's obviously part of what we do together and even why we work together some. But then I want to talk about a last issue around not doing due diligence well. And that is it possible that what a buyer is willing to pay changes between the letter of intent and closing day?
Absolutely.
Tell us about that.
And again, it depends on the buyer. There are some buyers. I was eating lunch with a biz dev guy yesterday that's doing business development for a private equity company.
Got it.
And he said, I pride myself in not retrading LOIs.
Yeah.
But what that means is he does a good bit of diligence up front. He takes his time getting there and understanding, like, okay, I'm comfortable with this, and I'm not going to retrade that. You got other firms that throw out LOI after LOI.
Correct.
In fishing expeditions, they get a bite, and then they're counting on driving that price down through diligence. They're going to dig until they find something wrong, and then get a little bit better deal. And the idea there is that they wear the seller down. You're emotionally invested in the process instead of your business, and you just don't say no at that point. It's like, man, we made it this far. I'm paying the attorney bills. I don't want to pay them without getting paid. It's just one thing after another. So they're investing in the wrong thing.
I get it. I think the key insight to take away from your experience, John, is as a seller, you don't know what kind of approach your potential purchaser is bringing to the table. Like, let's say it's two private equity firms, and one has this sort of slow to enter into LOI process and they don't retrade, and another one's just firing out 100, 10 LOIs a day or every week, and they're trying to retrade. And so I think if you don't want to get in the crosshairs of all that, you need to do that due diligence in advance. So, because if you don't, and all your T's aren't crossed and your I's aren't dotted, then you're going to give that potential professional buyer the right and the ability to negotiate downward with you and pay 10%, 20%, 30% less, or to sort of kick it out into an earnout. Would you concur with that?
Oh, absolutely. Biggest leverage point, Micah, and having done diligence ahead of time before you get to negotiating the transaction, it's all in your head. And it comes down, the strongest advantage you can have in any negotiation is the ability and willingness to say no.
Yeah.
And when you invest in your business instead of that particular transaction, it is much easier to say no.
Oh, I like that. Let's go here for a quick second. Our focus in our firm at Legendary Exits is to transform companies to be best in class. That's a term we use to describe the 75th percentile. So statistically, a client, where we're trying to take every client, is better than 75% of all the companies in their industry, as evidenced by profit percentage and other metrics, right? What I'm hearing you say is, if you get out in advance of this, and you actually invest to transform your company to best in class, and you do all the due diligence in advance of taking your company, that's your better play, because it's going to grow value, and it's going to make sure that you don't get your LOI retraded at a lower price.
And it's going to give you the confidence to say no when somebody challenges you.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
all this comes down to, it's all mental, right? It's all in your head.
100%.
And if you do the prep work and you get yourself ready, you're going to be ready mentally to go into a negotiation. You're going to be confident in telling the buyer, this is my business and I'm confident in it.
I want to, as maybe just a quick last topic, I want to just walk folks through that preparation and transaction process as simply as we can. Because again, I think so many folks are very confused. They're hearing advice from these niche points of view. First, I want to start with, from your point of view, what should happen before a company goes live, right? And when I say goes live, I'm going to assume that a company is working with a third party, a business broker, an M&A advisor, an investment banker to rep them to sell the company. What should happen ideally if you were guiding the client's preparation process? What should happen in prior to that point in time?
So ideally, you and I would get involved well before a investment banker, because by the time the investment banker gets there, the sale's imminent. You're moving down the road. You're not going to move the needle on growth. You're not going to increase your value at that point. It's just a matter of them doing the best job of putting a new paint, new paint, new flowers.
We're putting the lipstick on the pig, so to speak. We're trying to make it marketable. We're not trying to grow value at that point. So it's clear to me, and again, we could say the same thing for anybody who's a transaction professional, a business broker, an M&A advisor, a investment banker. When you engage with them, because you're actually ready to sell, the likelihood you're going to increase value is slim to nil. So again, in advance, multi-years in advance, what are you doing with your discipline, with the due diligence you've talked about? Walk us through specifically. Due diligence is such a broad term. It's like saying business analyst, or it's like saying I like classical music, which, I'm a classically trained cellist. There's so many different subsets. Walk us through in due diligence. What are the kinds of due diligence that you do with a client? Because I know you've got a process, and I know many attorneys do.
Yeah, so I'm doing the legal due diligence is specifically what I'm focused on. But the fact of the matter is that overlaps with kind of the two other major areas, which is operational. How do you do things? What are your processes? What are your procedures? And a buyer's going to be looking at that in terms of how do we integrate? Financial, what's the performance? Buyer's going to be looking at in terms of how can we juice this once we buy it? How can we increase margins? How can we decrease
legal, financial, operational due diligence being the three. I'm going to come back to comments you made earlier to just tease out the financial. Are our books up to date? Are they in order? Do they conform to industry best practices? Are they getting closed by the 15th of the month, if not sooner? When we get to a certain size, do we have assurance on our financials, like audited financials? And then specifically for a deal, there is a sort of a study that we can do called a Q of E, or quality of earnings. And that gives confidence, as a former CFO, that gives confidence to a buyer that what they're seeing on financial statements is not just management's representation, but that a third-party auditor has come in and really validated both the income and the expense, streams. So that's classically a lot of what we're seeing from the financial due diligence. Operational due diligence, of course, is just, do we have defined processes, and how are we doing certain things? And as you've talked about, do we have employees properly classified? Do we have an employee handbook? All these sorts of things. And so, our firm oftentimes will lead the charge in the financial and the operational. But coming back to the legal, take us deeper. Are there 2 or 3 areas of legal due diligence that you're looking at with a client?
I think there's 8.
8. What are those?
So I'm looking at, first thing I look at is corporate governance.
Okay.
If you're a corporation, do you have stock certificates? Do you have a stock ledger? Are we sure the people that you say own the business actually own the business? And is there evidence of it?
Got it.
Do you have an operating agreement? Great. What's it going to take to approve a sale? How do these mechanisms work? How do the owners interact with each other? So corporate governance.
And that's super important. I'm going to chime in here for a quick moment, because for so many businesses, family generational, sub 100 million in revenue, privately owned, sometimes we develop these documents, we put them in a drawer, and we live as if they don't exist. So we actually don't know what's in them pragmatically. And that's why it's super important to have the attorney coming back and saying, what do they actually say? So back to you on the second point.
Yeah, so corporate governance is one. I'm looking at contractual relationships. What kinds of contracts, what kinds of terms, what kinds of expirations. Favorite story that I like to tell from my own experience was I was sitting in the warehouse in Texas, and my landlord walked in and he goes, "Hey, we need to renegotiate our lease." I said, "Oh, great. When's it coming up for renewal?" He said, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So luckily he was a good guy, and he didn't hold me over a barrel for the fact that I probably owed him, double rent holdover for 2 years.
Yeah.
But that, he could have played hardball and said, I'm increasing your rent and this is what it's going to be,
Well,
and I didn't have much choice.
and that's an important one, obviously, from a buyer's point of view, because a buyer wants to know, hey, if I buy this business, if it's operating out of facilities, let's assume it's not a fully remote company, right? Are we paying market rents on our facilities? How long are these leases in place? Because if I'm not paying market rent or I don't have a lease in place and rent's going to go up day after closing, well, then this company isn't as profitable as I thought it was when I looked at the financial statements. So that would just be a really specific
Yeah.
example under that contractual. So
Yeah.
that's great. What else under these eight areas?
So contractual relationships, I'm looking at property. So, and that's really kind of the lease. That's a
Yep.
subset of the contractual. Labor and employment. So are you classifying your employees correctly? Do you have restrictive covenants? Do you need restrictive covenants? And restrictive covenants are confidentiality, non-solicit, things like that. And
Yeah.
depending on the business, that could be really important or it could be not so important.
And I'll chime in here and say, from my point of view, the biggest issue that we see with classification is hourly employees being told that they're exempt from hourly pay, right? So they're getting paid a salary, but they actually don't meet the requirements, which is a twofold test of a certain amount of money as well as certain authorities, right? And so now that employee that folks have been classifying as hourly as salary for years really is entitled to all this back overtime. So that just would be a pragmatic implication of that, amongst others.
Yeah, and depending on the state, it's funny, when I was working with big firm, I had a lawyer sitting in California. We were doing a transaction, and there's all this nuance.
Yes.
And the lawyer actually told me, the lawyer sitting in California, barred in California, said, we tell our clients not to do business here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's state by state. You got to look out for labor and employment issues, and there can be a lot of nuance depending on where you are.
Right. So we've gone through 4. What are the remaining 4 that you do due diligence on?
Employed benefits is one of them. So do you have all your 5500s for your benefits filed? Do you have your plans is it a qualified plan? Is it all that stuff that goes with employee benefits?
Great.
Insurance coverage. Are your policies up to date? Do you have the right coverages? The next one is regulatory. So do you have the right licenses and permits? If you're doing business overseas, are you doing it in compliance with OFAC and some of the other things?
Yeah. And honestly, even here in the US, it could be, we had a really aggressive, and I think Lena is still the head of the FTC, but the FTC has really been strong on marketing compliance for many years now and really going after a lot of different companies around marketing compliance. So, industry by industry, when we talk about regulatory compliance, each industry has its own set of hot buttons. And so for companies, as an example, who do totally online distribution, the FTC is all over marketing compliance right now. So yeah, keep going. So we've hit 7 regulatory. What's our last one?
Actually,
or maybe we covered the 8.
I got more.
You got even more. So it's more than 8. Okay.
Yeah, I got information technology. So what's your software or what's your infrastructure look like?
Got it.
For information technology? Are you in the cloud? Are you in servers? Do you do pen testing? Those things that are kind of industry standard protections that if you could point to it and say, I've been doing everything right, your liability is going to be less.
Yeah. And this is important because of all the emerging data privacy laws. We're not subject to GDPR like the European Union is yet, but we have certain states in our country that, as you might imagine, they are leading the way on that. There's certain requirements that are there. And I've been the CFO of a company that's had, potential security incidents, and it's a huge issue, right?
Well, and that interplays with your contracts too. Who do you have to notify? When do you have to notify? Is your customer contract properly disclosed and set forth your policies, what you're actually going to do?
Yes.
Intellectual property, so patents, IP, copyrights. What do you have? And some of this is just indexing, right? It's having it available, knowing what you have, and then financial. And most of that's just making sure it's collected, make sure you can run the reports that a buyer is going to be looking for.
Cool.
I'm not doing a lot of analysis on the financial, but it's nice to have it on hand. And I try to tell people, you're going to have to give them these sorts of reports. Go ahead and build those reports and know where you're going to get the data.
Got it.
And then environmental is the last one. So if you're any kind of manufacturing,
yes.
is a big one. You're looking for environmental.
Yeah,
if you're
there's a
servicing
reason. There's a reason why our beautiful waterfall in the middle of downtown Greenville looks dirty as anything, and that's because we used to be the textile capital of the world, and everybody was dumping all those dyes into the river for years. So, whether it's that or whether it's a piece of real estate that may have tanks in the town, in the ground, or anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the
That's
big
really
one's
good.
making sure they're not cooking meth in the bathroom. So.
So you walked us through, I'm just going to recap real quick.
Yeah.
At least 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 areas that
Yeah,
you're kicking the tires on. Corporate governance, including operating agreements, contracts, property, labor and employment, employee benefits, insurance coverage, regulatory, IT, intellectual property, financial and environmental. And that's a lot. It's a lot to navigate on your own, and I can understand why owners need to partner with an M&A attorney to walk through these expectations of a buyer, to see where they're at today, to see what the gap is, and to actually have time to fix these things, right? So they can close the deal, so that the deal doesn't get traded in an LOI. But also, because what I figured out over the years is there are certain things that are just great business. And a lot of times when you deal with these audits and these risk assessments, you start to say, there's actually a better way to do stuff that's going to drive revenue and profits and valuation. So,
well, and I think the best analogy I give people for that, Micah, when I was in the military, I was in a Ranger unit. The regimental commander was coming through for an inspection, and my team leader kept us all up all night with black nail polish, painting the eyelets of our boots and all of our web gear. And I said, "Sir, what in the world? Everybody else went to bed hours ago. This stuff's fine. Like, why do we? It's just going to wear off." He's like, "Number one, if our gear looks brand new, the RCO is not going to stop and look any further.
yes.
Number two, if we are taking the time to inspect the paint on the eyelets of the boots, we're going to notice that the stitching's coming loose, and we'll trade it in before we go to combat, and it becomes a bigger problem."
I love that. So we talk a lot about attractiveness to buyers. It's like curb appeal with a house, and readiness, ready to pass the home inspection, so to speak, ready to pass due diligence when you're buying a company. So as you were dealing with attractiveness, your commanding officer is basically saying, hey, we're going to figure out where the issues are at by dealing with that issue. I love that.
Well, and it's attention to detail. If you're going to that level of detail in your diligence process, the buyer's going to look at it and go, oh, wow, this is really well put together. I don't need to dig too far.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you're going to know that you've already fixed the problems if they do.
I love it.
So it's twofold. And really the more important one is the fact that you're fixing the issues.
Hey, I know we're coming towards the close of our time here. I did want to just ask, are you able in 2-3 minutes or less so we talked about the preparation, the due diligence piece, which ideally is being done before LOI, but we know a lot of the times it's not being done until after. So heads up, if you're a business owner, you're listening to this, you say, I want to sell for max price and terms. I want to net the greatest amount of profitability. One of your big issues you're hearing from this conversation today is you got to start in advance on the due diligence. You wait till after you sign the LOI or you take the company to the market, you're losing money.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want to just come back in the close and say, LOI to finish line. Can you walk us through that in 2-3 minutes or less? What is that process? What are you doing as the M&A attorney in that process?
Assuming that we've done diligence or not.
Walk us through the easy, and then walk us through the hard, where we haven't done due diligence.
I'll do the hard, and then I'll tell you what I'd take out of that for the easy. So if you haven't done due diligence, you get the LOI, and then you're immediately going to get a due diligence request list. Yep. And that's going to be somewhere between 150 and 250 discrete questions and data points that the buyer is looking for. And you're going to look at it, and you're going to go, oh, crap, I don't know where all this is. Or, oh, crap, I really need to get Susie in accounting to pull those contracts, but she doesn't know about the transaction. Yep. So I'm going to have to do it myself. And so all of a sudden, all this is just coalesced right on you, and you're going, oh my gosh. And then on top of that, the buyer is giving you a 30 to 75 page purchase agreement that you're having to negotiate with the attorneys, and you're having to learn these terms like indemnification and all this different stuff and what's a real risk. And you're finding out like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know my business had this problem. And then the buyer comes back on the first round of due diligence and says, hey, you didn't give us all this stuff, or we found all this other stuff that now you got to deal with or you got to follow up on. And you're going, well, I was just trying to read the purchase agreement, and I'm on page 5, and I got a 3-hour call with the attorney tomorrow to talk to him about it, and you want all this stuff, and you're telling me that closing is going to push in, oh my gosh, and then it's like, oh wait, I got to negotiate employment. And then the buyer comes back and says, hey, we're going to jigger the cost on this because we found these risks, or we're going to increase the holdback, or we're going to change the structure of the transaction from a stock deal to an asset purchase deal because we can't tolerate the risk that you've built in your business. And then you're going to have to go to your accountant and talk to them about the tax implications. And you're trying to keep this whole thing running and on speed while you're doing it.
So the two big things I'm hearing from you are dealing with due diligence. So if we don't do due diligence in advance of the letter of intent, now we get overwhelmed by it. So that's big thing one. Big thing two is really the purchase agreement, understanding all those reps and warranties, and then negotiating the reps and warranties. And then the third thing that I've just heard you call out is, every buyer's got goals, particularly around the money in particular. And so when the deal structure starts changing, if you haven't done advanced planning, which, we do this way in advance. It's part of our first 6 months where we pull in a client's tax advisor, their financial advisor, and we start modeling all this out. But if you don't, then you're kind of worried. You're like, well, what am I going to pay in taxes? Is this really going to be enough money? So, but again, the two big things I hear is letter of intent, due diligence, negotiating the purchase agreement.
And employment agreements.
And all the associated transaction documents, which could be employment agreements for employees that are staying on board.
And then the other thing you're dealing with is you got the buyer's integration folks starting to hit you for things.
Yep.
They're going, hey, post-closing, we need to have these systems online. We need to have access to these things. So you're dealing with pre-closing integration issues. You're dealing with negotiating the purchase agreement. You're dealing with responding to due diligence on the financial and the legal front. And you're trying to run your business.
Yeah.
And you might even be negotiating employment terms separately.
Last question I'll serve you up, and then we'll wind down and tell folks how they can connect with you is, if this is a succinct question, so obviously a lot of the clients we're working with, they're considering all sorts of different transition options, right? It could be converting to an ESOP, which is selling their company to the employees. It could be selling to a group of employees as a management buyout. It could be selling to an existing partner. It could be selling to a family member and a family generational. It could be that third-party sale to private equity or even a strategic acquirer who's doing programmatic M&A in their space. Here's the question, sort of understanding there's 6, 7 different ways to sell companies at minimum, and some of those have variations. How does the kind of acquirer influence the due diligence process? So a management buyout versus an ESOP versus a private equity firm doing a roll-up. Is there a significant difference in your opinion about, the kind of due diligence that they're going to look for?
Oh, absolutely. And I would, the two kind of big buckets I would put them into are internal, strategic, and then PE.
Okay.
And an internal transaction is the by far easiest.
Yep.
Because when I draft a purchase agreement, usually there's not another attorney.
Yeah.
Usually it's me representing the
company. Yep.
And I don't put barely any reps and warranties in there because those guys already know the risks.
Yeah, there's an assumption that the buyers are intimately acquainted with the operations and the risks and all that.
Yeah. So that's a very, very simple, generally non-negotiated transaction that just has to have the T's crossed and the I's dotted. That's the easiest.
Right.
You talk about, well, with unless you qualify an ESOP as an internal transaction, that is a very, very complex and expensive transaction.
With a whole lot of fees associated with it too.
Yeah.
There's a third-party investment bank generally involved going out, getting that non-recourse debt, et cetera.
And a trustee.
Yep.
There's lots of moving pieces to that one. So I kind of set that one aside from everything else. It's just a different animal.
Internal, easiest, and then we had strategics and PEs. Which one's the hardest and which one's the middle on due diligence in your mind between the PE and the strategic?
They're kind of neck and neck.
Okay.
It depends on the buyer and what their goals are. If they're buying customer lists and they don't care about the operations, they might not look at a lot of risk. You know, it depends on the kind of business. It depends for a PE. Is this a platform acquisition or is it a roll up?
Yeah.
Meaning, is it the first company in that vertical, or is it one that's being added on to others?
I'm going to come
So,
back to a comment. I'm going to tie together something you shared early in this conversation with where we're at right now, and that is we were talking about conflict and how to resolve it, and you gave us the insight that we really need to seek to understand from the other person's point of view, right? And so I think knowing what you're building to, right? If I'm a owner now who says I want to sell in 3 to 5 years, and I'm working through these different options, and I say, man, I really would love to sell to a private equity group because I'm going to get that premium multiple versus, hey, I really want to sell to 2 or 3 key employees as a management buyout. Well, that's going to help me understand what their perspective is and why they would want to buy the company, what they're going to pay for it, but then also what the level of due diligence is. And so key, I think, lesson in all of business is just we always want to put ourselves in the other person's shoes and know what their objectives and motivations are.
yeah, and the one caveat or clarification I would add to that is don't assume you know who your buyer is going to be.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
You know,
Yeah,
and you want to prep for the worst case. And even if it is internal, where you're not going to have to make a lot of reps and warnings that are not a lot of risk, you still don't want to hand your employees a big bag of crap. So.
yeah, exactly. So, well, man, this has been awesome. I feel like we've rounded the bases on so many different topics. You get an awesome point of view because of growing up in a family business, a technical background, transforming operations, logistics, supply chain, then coming into mergers and acquisitions, doing 350 plus deals. Really awesome. Let's just close with this. If folks are interested in connecting with you, if there are folks listening to this saying, man, I really need to get in front of this and I want to start having a conversation and figuring out, okay, what is this kind of due diligence legally that I need to be doing that not only would get me ready, but transform my company? How would folks connect with you? What's the best way to do that?
Website is www.treebanklegal.com. TreeBank Legal is all one word. My email is jmartin@treebanklegal.com. And my phone number is 864-903-0692. If I don't answer it, send me a text and I'll pick it up.
Awesome. John, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to learn from you and learn with you. And I appreciate you serving up these insights for our audience.
Micah, thank you for having me on, man. This has been a great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, man.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining us on Legendary Exits. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and be sure to subscribe to the show to stay connected with more stories of purpose-driven exits. You can find more information at legendaryexits.com. Until next time.